I'm gonna speak from personal experience because that's all I can ever really speak about. And I wanted to briefly talk today about how awakening to our nature as presence can sometimes change the relationships we find ourselves in our lives. And of course, everything I'm going to say in this video is not the truth. It's just what happened here and the experience here. And if some of you resonate with it and can find a little bit of help with this, that's great. But I wouldn't want anyone to believe that this is always the way it is. And also, there are many reasons why relationships change or break down or shift. And we can't, to say that it is just because of one reason doesn't even feel accurate. But what I have noticed is that if the if the awakening is authentic, and if this deeper calling and being drawn to the deeper truth within us is real, then and if also that gets recognized and we start recognizing and living from this deeper dimension, so to speak, of being, then it seems even inevitable that the environment around us, not only the relationships, but the environment around us, the things we do, the things that used to drive us, can start to slow down and shift. This is what happened here. So today I want to focus on the relationships part. And what seems to have happened is this. Before awakening and before recognizing that what you really are is this wholeness itself, the wholeness of life and what you are, before recognizing that consciously, directly, I was believing that I was this incomplete self and separate, and also that my worth was dependent on certain circumstances and certain conditions that had to happen in order to prove my worth as a human being. And this is usually based on childhood patterning and conditioning, which is very unconscious, and it happens because somehow we believe that one or more of our parental figures are there to give us that worth and that acceptance. And without it, we don't have it. Because that is the belief we grow up with, we become very skilled at acting in ways and making seeming choices that will get us that sense of feeling loved and worthy and feeling like we are enough. So our relationships are driven by trying to feel that way, whether consciously or not, and trying to get that love and approval. And in my particular circumstance, approval seeking was the strategy there. And so a lot of relationships of all kinds, whether romantic, whether friendships, whether extended family, whether even clients, early on seemed to be driven by that need to be approved of and to be accepted. when awakening happens, and in my particular case, it took quite a few years before this patterning and this conditioning and this software, so to speak, started to really slow down and come to an end. So it's not like awakening happens and the next day that conditioning stops. That is not my experience, and it is not the experience of any person I have met that has had this awakening, this non-dual awakening. But over time, if the devotion to this awakening and the seriousness and sincerity with which you are willing to deepen and meet every aspect of yourself that comes up, if that is there over time, and it took me many years actually, and there's a little bit of embarrassment, but actually there's also a deeper compassion for the human condition and for how relentless and ruthless those patterns continue to be sometimes, even after this recognition, which is so profound and life altering in some ways, where you see that you are not that person and you are not those beliefs. And yet, even with that direct and experiential recognition, those patterns continue. And so this is where therapy is useful. This is where a more honest investigation is useful when it comes to uprooting, so to speak, these patterns. But eventually, once your life starts to be pervaded, so to speak, by this understanding, then at one point the pattern has no choice but to dissolve and just to be seen through more and more clearly for what it is. And when that happens, the relationships that were born out of that conditioning mostly, and that were maintained out of that conditioning, suddenly lose their resonance and are suddenly, you may also have the feeling of not even remembering why you were in that relationship in the first place. And that can be very disorientating. I hope that's the right word. And very shocking also. To find yourself in relationships that maybe have been there for decades and that you've known even since you were a child, that all of a sudden not only don't resonate in the same way, but that you see are based on some dynamics that to the one that you now see yourself to be, those dynamics are suddenly sometimes unacceptable or not sustainable, or suddenly have a perfume of disrespect or insincerity. They don't feel as sincere as they used to be. And this is not anybody's fault, ultimately. We're all just operating from mostly unconscious and very automatic ways. But now those relationships don't reflect anymore the truth and the values that you're now discovering you have as a consequence of this recognition. And those values usually have to do with authenticity and honesty and kindness, not in a moralistic way, but just because that seems to be the natural expression, the natural human expression of this deeper awareness that we now recognize is the truth of what we are. And so a lot of grief can come from these shocking realizations that now the relationships that you have always longed for are not what seems right anymore. And now there is the very painful act of having to either cut them off drastically if those relationships are now discovered to be emotionally abusive and intrinsically disrespectful. But not all of relationships are that. Sometimes they're not abusive, they're not disrespectful, but somehow they don't resonate anymore. And the things that we used to have in common might not be there anymore. And there may be this very real sense of lack of resonance. Like it's in some ways, it's like you changed the channel. And so you're operating in seemingly different dimensions, even. That doesn't feel like the right word, but maybe you know what I mean. And there's there's been a lot of grief around that. And it's interesting because there can be massive grief, in the severing of relationships that maybe have been there forever, and sadness and the loss of that, and all sorts of emotions around that. But at the same time, the deeper knowing that it is absolutely the right thing to do, maybe, to not be in those relationships anymore, or to move away from certain people that don't seem like they are respectful even of the person you are becoming, the human you are becoming. Because sometimes, even with the people that we've known for the longest, they have this idea of who you are, which is based on that previous conditioning mostly. And now sometimes they seem like they cannot update this idea of who you are and sort of come to terms with the new experience you're having of life. And so the resonance is not there anymore, and we move away. And by the way, all of what I have described happens a lot even with people that don't have awakening. Sometimes this is just the consequence of growing up. And we can't all continue to have the same friends, and it is actually quite a normal evolution sometimes to move away from certain people that you were so close to before. Awakening and non-duality is not necessarily the reason why this happens to most people. And with awakening and non-duality, where what I would say one of the deepest changes is that you now recognize the patterns you used to have, and you know yourself as this wholeness where you don't need certain people anymore. So you just choose them for who they are. And so you choose people based on whether the relationship feels kind and respectful, and sometimes whether there is a resonance there and we have things in common. When we start choosing relationships as opposed to being in them just because we know people from a long time, for example, then maybe the pool becomes smaller, but definitely more in line with who you are today. And the relationships feel more authentic. And this is not anybody's fault. You know, there can be moments and periods where anger arises because of this. And even maybe you can start blaming, other people's behaviors. But ultimately, you see that it could only have gone that way. And if the relationship is worth saving based on the values you have today, then it's useful to go and do that and to have difficult conversations. And if the relationship doesn't feel like it is kind enough or respectful enough to go through the hard conversations, then it's okay to let it go and to grieve it. Every situation is unique, and it requires, an analysis and an honest look at that particular relationships. You can't make rules for everyone. It's each connection needs to be looked at and, updated, just like we would update anything else in our lives. And yeah, so it's not always talked about, the aftermath, so to speak, of awakening and how that shifts things and changes things. And here, personally, there is still a lot of grief around many of the relationships that have shifted or ended. And of course, a really important part of this is that as these changes happen, it leaves more room for new connections and new experiences and new situations that suddenly reflect who you are today. And so a lot of new beautiful connections have appeared and continue to appear of, with people that share your, not necessarily your understanding of awakening, but your values, you know? Because it has to be said, there are many people that you might share this non-duality path with and this awakening, but there might still not be resonance, at a human level. So it's so more complicated and mysterious than what we like to think, and why we resonate with certain people and why we don't. It's not just because of your spiritual path or not at all, actually. But it is important to stay humble and to stay curious, about yourself, your patterns, and your blind spots, and to just be open to what is there and to this unpredictable life, that brings these changes and these shifts, and we just go with them, trusting that who better than life knows what's right for us.